welcome to Indignant Studies. Today we're going to be talking about eviction protests, namely tenants unions, eviction blockades, rent strikes, and courthouse protests. These actions are as old as evictions themselves and are the most common and most effective form of protesting and halting eviction. And they are more relevant than ever with the massive eviction crisis looming here in America. We went into the pandemic already experiencing a housing crisis where 46% of renters and 81% of renters making under $30K a year were considered cost burden, meaning they spend more than 30% of their income on rent. This disparity is even higher in communities of color, with 54% of Black renters and 52% of Hispanic renters being considered cost burdened. On top of all of this, large cities across America are experiencing their largest homeless population since the Great Depression, which once again disproportionately affects Black people, people of color, and LGBTQ people. On top of that, millions of people have lost their jobs during the pandemic. There are millions of households who are behind on rent and close to eviction if they haven't already been evicted or are being evicted currently. The aid that we have received has done little to help people pay bills, let alone catch up on bills they've fallen behind on. And once again, those most likely to have lost their jobs or not have access to aid are Black people and other people of color. Hundreds of thousands of evictions are pending for when the moratorium ends. And like I said before, people are already getting evicted or already have been evicted. There are many loopholes in the moratorium. People don't always know how it works, and even when they do, they don't always qualify. On top of that, there are many illegal evictions happening that aren't being enforced. And without lawyers, which most people who cannot afford rent also cannot afford, judges overwhelmingly rule on the landlord's side. A major way people are stopping these evictions is by literally just stopping themselves with the help of activist groups and protests. In March, a petition to close eviction courts in New York State circulated online and gained 90,000 signatures. Through it, they were able to find activists who were ready to do something about the eviction crisis and connect people who can't afford their rent with tenants unions and other nonprofits. They even managed to get hundreds of people to pack the streets around an eviction court in Brooklyn in June. And in November, a tenant union in Rochester, New York was able to organize a successful eviction blockade for a man and his 2 children by creating a human chain around his building and stopping officers from being able to get inside. That man and his 2 children are still there today. And in LA in August, organizers were able to keep another man in his home after he was a week late on rent and his landlords had already removed his things from his apartment. This time, they created another human chain, but around the van that was taking his stuff away. In the meantime, an activist who was also a contractor showed up, removed the locks, and the remaining activists took the man's things and put him back into his apartment. And in New Orleans in July, people were able to shut down a whole day's worth of evictions by this time not just forming a human chain around a courthouse, but literally chaining themselves around the courthouse, not allowing any of the staff or judges to get inside, making it so they had to reschedule not only all the evictions for the day, but everything else they had to do for the day on top of it. And last month, Kansas City Tenants was able to halt over 90% of the evictions in their city through their Zero Evictions January efforts. They committed to some form of action every day to halt evictions and combined a number of different actions in person and from home. They organized numerous blockades at a local county courthouse to prevent workers and judges from going inside. On top of this, they had people who couldn't make it to the blockade either email or call targeted judges and city council members to stop the evictions, implement a real moratorium, and cancel rents. They were very successful and able to halt close to 1,000 evictions in their city, and they even won a 2-week freeze on evictions. And in the meantime, while this 2-week freeze was happening, they organized at other county courts, halting even more evictions. As I said before, eviction protests are as old as evictions themselves. Ever since people started getting thrown out of their home for one reason or another, their neighbors and community members have come together to be like, hey, not cool. Put them back. And put their own bodies on the line to make sure that their neighbors were safe and sheltered. They have also been an integral part of the housing and tenant movements here in America and worldwide. Here in America, they first gained popularity during the Great Depression when tons of people were out of work and there was massive evictions happening across the country. From 1930 to 1933, people all across the country organized into unemployed councils that were put on by the U.S. Communist Party, who had quite a presence here in America at the time. These councils organized rent strikes and eviction blockades all across the country. And depending on the city, it was a building, a neighborhood, or sometimes multiple neighborhoods. They also had marches, their largest one being on D.C., and courthouse sit-ins all across the country demanding people get either paid who were out of work or kept inside their homes who couldn't afford to pay for them. And if all else failed, they would literally just take a person's things and put them right back in their home. And nowhere was the tenant movement in the U.S. stronger than in New York City. Due to it being the main port of entry during the massive immigration that happened in the 1800s, a lot of people who came to America just opted to stay in New York City instead of traveling west. And this led to unprecedented and unimaginable growth for the city. And the side effect of this unanticipated growth was that a lot of these immigrants were living in homes that were either never meant for residents or had not been meant for residents for a very long time. So this movement began to form in the mid-1800s and slowly gained steam until they won the first tenant rights bill in New York that defined what a building for legal residence was in 1901. And in 1930, these unemployed councils organized eviction blockades and rent strikes in just a couple of buildings in East Bronx. And unfortunately, these eviction blockades and rent strikes were quickly met with police crackdown. Tenants had zero rights back then, nor a lease to enforce. So this meant that when police showed up to evict, they were already on the landlord's side. And when things didn't go their way, of course, it became violent. And each crackdown generally just led to more protests later on that were met with even more crackdowns and even threats from the city government and the mayor, until these rent strikes and eviction blockades had spread to Brownsville, Williamsburg, Borough Park, the Lower East Side, and had an even larger presence in the East Bronx. Not to mention, during this time, there were continued marches and courthouse sit-ins that I mentioned before. A common tactic used in these New York City eviction blockades was for the men to stay inside with the children and physically blockade the door, while the women went outside and formed another external blockade with the neighbors and supportive communists. These actions stopped hundreds of thousands of evictions from going through and led to all sorts of reforms and protections being passed in New York. On top of that, the larger movement nationwide, combined with the labor movement and anti-prohibition of the time, led to the passage of the sleeping legislature that was the New Deal, giving people things like Social Security insurance, unemployment insurance, and the right to form a union. And while after the Great Depression these actions never stopped, they wouldn't gain as much popularity until the Civil Rights Movement several decades later. There were a lot of black leaders of these unemployed councils during the Great Depression. Because they were community-based, there were many all-black tenant unions and multiracial tenant unions that were led by black people. And while I was praising the New Deal just seconds ago for its sweeping legislature that we still use to this day, its other legacy is its racist housing policy that strengthened segregation and left many harmful and long-lasting impacts on the black community here in America. First, there was the Federal Housing Act of 1934. This act established the Federal Housing Administration and offered federally backed mortgages so that many Americans could buy houses. And by many Americans, I mean many white Americans, because these federally backed mortgages were not offered in black neighborhoods, they were not offered in white neighborhoods that touched black neighborhoods, and they were not offered to black people who could afford houses in white neighborhoods. On top of that, many of these deeds for these houses, it was written that they could not be sold to a black person in the future. This practice came to be known as redlining because when deciding which neighborhoods to offer these federally backed mortgages, they would often draw up maps that were color-coded, and the all-black neighborhoods would be outlined in red. On top of that, black Americans who could afford to buy houses had to buy them on contract instead of with mortgages. These contracts were extremely unfair and meant that they would have to make payments to the seller, and they would not be able to get the deed until the home was completely paid off. So they had all the responsibility of a homeowner with none of the protections. As soon as they missed a payment, they could be evicted. They could not accumulate equity in their home, and once they were evicted, they were left with tons of debt. Not to mention, these homes were usually sold to them for twice or 3 times as much as the market rate. And as fucked up as that was, it doesn't end there, because the New Deal was also responsible for building a plethora of public housing in America. And the construction of this public housing could not alter the racial makeup of the neighborhoods that they were built in. This meant market rate, all white housing in white neighborhoods with strong screening practices and subsidized housing for neighborhoods that were largely populated by black people and other people of color. And although there was market rate housing also built in these neighborhoods, those federally backed mortgages I talked about earlier led to even further destruction of these neighborhoods and public housing. As many white people left public housing to buy homes in the suburbs, these unsubsidized units gradually became subsidized, loosening their screening practices, and became predominantly occupied by black people and other people of color. And once middle-class white people left these buildings, they were overwhelmingly neglected, and public opinion shifted to associate them with black people, poverty, and crime. The conditions of these homes were more often than not completely decrepit, unsafe, and unlivable for the tenants that occupied them. This meant that even though black people participated in these unemployed councils and led many of them, the gains from that movement just ended up royally screwing them over by strengthening segregation and leading to the further destruction of their neighborhoods through that isolation. These obviously unethical living conditions that were inflicted upon black communities across America led to massive revitalization of the rent strike, with the most notable ones being in New York City and Chicago. In 1963, tenants at a building in New York City picketed the health department for failing to eliminate rats from the building after the landlord abandoned it. This led to the spread of rent strikes across Harlem, with coordinated non-payment and demonstrations and sit-ins to draw attention to their demands for better living conditions and the construction of more public housing. This led to the creation of a new housing court, an increase in building inspectors, and the legalization of rent strikes for those in unmaintained buildings in New York City in 1964. And just a couple years later, Martin Luther King Jr. would move to Chicago to lead marches, rent strikes, and many other demonstrations for fair and open housing, among many other issues, through the Chicago Freedom Movement. And these type of demonstrations would spread across the country and eventually lead to the passage of the Fair Housing Act of 1968. These rent strikes meant that many buildings came together and organized tenant councils in order to organize their protests. And it was from many of these tenant councils that the modern-day tenant unions that we know today became established in many major cities across the country. Established tenant unions began to take form during the 1970s, when a lot of activists were turning from street organizing to nonprofits. And while tenants unions never lost their roots of on-the-ground organizing, they were able to professionalize a little more and help connect people with different sorts of aids and help. These tenants unions were strongest in major cities and led to the passage of many tenants protections that we often take for granted today, like just cause evictions. And while many tenants unions were formed in the 70s and 80s, most of the tenants unions that are active today were actually formed in the last 10 years, when activism has been on the rise and housing has got so unaffordable that it is literally a crisis. And these tenants unions are great to get in contact with if you yourself are facing an eviction or if you want to help those who are. I compiled a Google Doc linked below with every tenant union I could find across America, organized by state. And while there are many tenant unions out there, some states with multiple tenant unions, there were 18 states where I literally couldn't find a tenant union, period. And while I plan to update the document as I find more tenant unions or more unions form, there are also several links at the bottom on how to start your own. And it's a lot easier than it sounds. A tenant union does not need to be citywide. All you need is a few people in your building to start one. And while it helps to know the people in your building, you'd be surprised how receptive people can be when you go door to door asking them what their problems are. Because often if you are experiencing an issue with your landlord or building, other people around you are too. Under normal circumstances, tenant unions are often formed because a landlord is not holding up their legal end of the bargain, like providing utilities or building maintenance, or to fight against things like rent increases and community displacement. So normally you would go door to door asking your neighbors about their concerns with the landlord or building, and if enough people are having issues and want to do something about it, then you can start holding meetings for your newly formed tenant union. At these meetings, the first thing you have to do is figure out what your biggest concerns as a building are, and it is a good practice to prioritize listening to those people who have either lived in the building the longest or are members of disenfranchised groups, because they often see and hear things and experience things that others don't. And then from there, you can start figuring out what you want to do about it. Are you going to organize a rent strike and withhold rent until your building is brought back up to code? Or maybe hold a picket to let the public know what's going on. You could have an action where you mass report problems in your building, or hold an eviction blockade to keep your neighbors in their homes. But present circumstances call for something a little different. If you do opt to door knock, please, please, please wear a mask and social distance. An alternative to door knocking is that you can flyer or leaflet doors in your building or neighborhood and set up an email for people to report problems or get involved if they want to help. This is often less effective and it is more expensive of the two options, but desperate times call for desperate measures, and we are living in unprecedented times right now. There are also tons of options to organize meetings online. Not everyone has access to a computer, so it is best to assess the situation you're in and figure out the best steps for your community. You can hold meetings outside that are social distance and where you're wearing masks. I think we're supposed to be double masking now. So that's all stuff to keep in mind when forming a tenant union. It is on all of us to stop the spread. Our healthcare workers are going through hell right now, and this is a responsibility that falls on all of us. So while Mass evictions will probably do much more to spread coronavirus than door knocking or protests. We still need to be as safe as we possibly can when organizing these types of actions. Especially because those who are most likely to be facing evictions right now or without jobs are also those who are most likely to be most burdened or die from this virus. And the stakes are incredibly high. Like I said, millions of people are behind on rent and are facing evictions right now or will be soon. Tons of people are behind on rent, and even with assistance, it is not a viable way out. A lot of activists are calling for things like the cancellation of rent and mortgage payments, and for things like strengthening aid and protection for tenants through strengthening and expanding the moratoriums across the country and in different states. So those are also great to keep in mind when forming your own tenants union. And if a tenant union forms in your area or already exists in your area, and although you are fine yourself, there are plenty of ways to get involved. Whether that's attending a courthouse protest, signal boosting online, attending an eviction blockade, or just donating your time and money in whatever way that you can. Support from the outside not only helps by strengthening actions through numbers or providing resources, but it also boosts morale for those organizing and those facing evictions, and shows the community that this is something that is urgent and needs to be cared about. It is also important to know the risks involved when organizing these types of actions. While rent strikes can be protected if your landlord isn't holding up their legal end of the bargain through things like maintenance and utilities, this varies widely by city and isn't protected otherwise. And a lot of people are rent striking right now, not because their landlord isn't holding up their legal end of the bargain, although many are. It is because there are, like I said earlier, millions of people who literally just can't afford to pay rent. But a legally protected form of free speech and an effective protest are those courthouse protests I talked about earlier. I've personally been going to protests since 2009, and a lot of them have either been at the county courthouse or at the city courthouse. The courts enforce the laws, and not only is it a legally protected form of free speech to rally outside, it is also proven to be effective. Eviction blockades, on the other hand, are a bit riskier. While they were able to keep that man and his 2 kids in their home in Rochester, New York back in November, in December, 50 people showed up to form another eviction blockade at a home for a woman and her 3 children, and 15 of them were arrested. The family was evicted, and they now live in separate homes. It is also extremely important to know the tenants' rights in your city or state. So if there is a tenant union in your area, they are invaluable to get in contact for these rights. But if not, a quick Google search will generally help. The more you know your rights, the better prepared you will be for any type of action you decide to go forward with. Another thing that makes or breaks a riskier action like an eviction blockade is how many people attend. An eviction involves police showing up to remove someone from their home. So if there are 20 people, it might not go so well. But if there are 100 people or more, it can be impossible for the police to do anything without calling for backup or rescheduling to another day. Public opinion also goes a long way. There's a strong correlation between how the public sees a type of protest and the types of methods police are willing to implement to break up that protest. Of course, there are exceptions, but basically, the more likely it is for there to be public outrage, then the less likely the police are to act. And if they know that no one around cares, they'll do whatever the fuck they want. This is important not only as someone trying to organize these types of protests, but also as an outside supporter. If the community says nothing, then violence can easily be inflicted upon protesters and those already suffering. The most effective tool out of all of these is the tenant union. It makes it easier to organize actions and to get the community involved, especially if there's already an established union in your city. I also highly recommend a courthouse protest. Not only are they a legally protected form of free speech, but they're a great way to show your community what is going on. And while eviction blockades and rent strikes can be riskier, they can also be extremely effective when done correctly, so use these at your own risk. I hope this helps anyone who is looking to fight back against the looming eviction crisis. As I said before, I have a Google Doc linked down below with every existing tenant union that I could find across the United States. If you know any that I missed, please let me know. I am more than happy to update and expand the document to better suit people's needs. I will also have my sources either in a Google Doc or links down below. I'm not entirely certain yet because this is the first YouTube video I've ever made or will be uploading to this platform. And if you like this topic, think it would help someone you know, or would like to know about the history and implementation of different protest actions in the future, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out in either the comments down below or my Twitter, which will be linked in the description. I'm happy to help in whatever way that I can. Thank you for watching, and please stay safe out there.